Please don't be shy. You like this and walking here? Yes. And I will introduce you, and then you have the podium to yourself. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shirley Williams. I'm the Professor of Elective Politics at the Kennedy School of Government. And it's my honor this evening to introduce President George Vassiliou, the former President of Cyprus from 1988 until 1993. Let me say a few words about him because it's a great pleasure to have him here with us this evening. First of all, President Vassiliou started life as a medical student, but very quickly moved on to becoming an economist. One might have argued whether he moved from the useful to the less useful, but that's a decision that the audience can make for itself. As an economist, he trained in the perhaps country most closely associated in the whole world with economics, namely Hungary, which was the cradle of our own Professor Kornai here at Harvard University, and he himself became a distinguished economist in the Hungarian Economic University of Budapest. And he was, at that time, studying, I found this out this evening, I was quite astonished by it, studying under a famous professor whose name some of you will recognize, Professor Imre Nagy, who subsequently, in 1956, led the Hungarian Revolution, which was the first of a whole series of revolutions which culminated in the so-called Peaceful Revolution of 1989. After being in Hungary for some years, studying economics and beginning to understand very well the structure of a command economy, President Vassiliou, at that time Dr. George Vassiliou, moved over to become the founder and head of a center of marketing research based upon the Middle East. Indeed, it was specifically called the Middle Eastern Center for Marketing Research, and in that he explored the impact of market economics on the Middle East and on countries like his own, Cyprus. He became more and more drawn into issues of international politics and international conciliation and arbitration prior to becoming president of Cyprus. But of course, in Cyprus, he inherited not only an island with amazing and rich ancient connections and associations with the world of ancient Hellenic Greece, but also an island that itself was riven by one of the earliest ethnic conflicts, the division between Turkish and Greek Cyprus. So the president, coming to power as an independent, without any connection to any party in Cyprus, made himself into an expert in a field which, alas, today is one of the most important and significant fields of international politics, the issue of ethnic relations, of ethnic conflict, and how those ethnic conflicts can be peacefully resolved. For Cyprus was the first of a long succession of countries that had been riven by divisions between peoples who no longer find it possible to live and to be governed together. Since he ceased to be president of Cyprus in 1993, a few months ago, he's founded a new movement, a new party in Cyprus, a party called the Free Democratic Movement, committed to internationalism, to a European future for Cyprus, and to the concepts of human rights and civil liberties. And tonight it's our honor to ask President Vassiliou to speak about those matters very close to his heart, issues of international order, of peacekeeping and peacemaking, of arbitration and conciliation, and not least of human rights and how they can be maintained in our chaotic world. President George Vassiliou.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored and pleased to be with you here tonight. And I would like to thank Professor Shirley Williams for her introduction and kind words. Every day, hundreds of people die, are injured, become refugees in their own countries, or suffer from hunger and deprivation across our planet. Many are victims of the ethnic conflicts flaring up around us everywhere. Some, like the Cyprus or the Arab-Israel conflict, have been with us for decades now. Others, like those in Bosnia, Georgia, and Armenia, are recent. Some are violent and involve continuous bloodshed. Some are not, for the time being. But the danger of violence always looms. The killing and suffering is taking place at a time when we would have expected peace and prosperity to reign supreme in the new world order. I have no doubt that all of us in this forum tonight greeted with great enthusiasm the demolition of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. Many hoped that the world was entering a new era of world peace and uninterrupted economic progress. The end of history was around the corner. The search of mankind for an ideal political system was over. Liberal democracy had prevailed over communism. Arcadia, that famous Greek place that everybody dreams of, was around the corner, where there would be an ideal and utopic state of affairs without conflict, strife, or wars, and where people would live in fraternity and brotherly love, cooperating and working for the common good. How disappointing it was for all of us that Arcadia never came, and that at this moment we have more points of tension on our small planet than ever, that more people were killed in Europe in the last 2 years than at any time since the Second World War, that the United Nations has reached breaking point and cannot afford to keep up with demands for peacekeepers around the world, that arms exports flourish, and that the danger of nuclear proliferation and of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists or dictators somewhere in the world is no longer in the realm of science fiction, but a very distinct possibility. In addition to all that, the world is facing its longest recession ever. The Uruguay gut round is still not completed, and every few months a new date for completion is agreed. Unemployment in Europe has reached record heights, and nobody has yet come up with a recipe to overcome it, while the post-World War II welfare state risks crumbling under the huge burden of its burgeoning costs. It is characteristic of this climate that a favorite theme in intellectual and academic circles today is Samuel Huntington's article on the clash of civilizations. From the end of history to the clash of civilizations within a short period of 2 years is indeed remarkable. We are all justified in worrying, particularly we Cypriots, together with many others like us who happen to live on the so-called fault lines separating civilizations. Probably this is why we have been struggling to solve one of the longest-running ethnic conflicts around, namely the Cyprus Problem. My dear friends, I was asked to address the subject that I have chosen to speak about tonight, managing ethnic conflicts in the New World Order. To address this subject, we must first answer the question whether ethnic conflicts, the flare-up of extreme nationalism or ethno-nationalism, as political scientists call it today, constitute a permanent or it is a transitory phenomenon. In other words, Are we simply powerless spectators facing an inevitable process which, after the end of Cold War and the collapse of communist ideology, will lead the world to a new era of extreme nationalism and chauvinism, the culmination of which could be a new Third World War or a clash of civilizations on an even bigger scale? If the answer to this question is positive, if we are indeed dealing with an unstoppable process, then obviously there can be no way in which we could manage conflicts. We could only try to limit the destruction. It would be like treating a patient who suffers from an incurable disease, and you know that the only thing you can do is to alleviate his pain, but you cannot cure him. Fortunately for all of us, at least this is what I believe, fortunately for our world and civilization, the answer is negative. We are not dealing with an unstoppable process. I would like to suggest that the present flare-up of nationalist movements, conflicts, and chauvinistic tendencies in many parts of Europe, and particularly in third world countries and in the ex-Comecon countries, is the natural consequence of the collapse of the communist ideology and of the tensions created by economic underdevelopment. But it is not, and I repeat, it is not a phenomenon that will grow and grow and grow. In the conditions created by the collapse of the communist system, it was natural to expect that nationalistic feelings and antagonisms suppressed for so long would come into the open, and that some leaders, in order to survive, would turn to ethno-nationalism. Sometime 2 years ago, when I had the honor of being the last foreign leader to visit the Soviet Union, only a few days afterwards, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, not because I visited. I was invited to speak at the International Academy, the Diplomatic Academy of Moscow, where all the diplomats of the ex-Soviet Union and now Russia are being trained. And speaking there about nationalism and the danger of conflicts, I said, paraphrasing a famous English, I wouldn't say philosopher, but very wise man, I said that the patriotism or nationalism is the refuge of every scoundrel. And I meant it. And that's what we see happening today. That people that had nothing to do with nationalism, that were making speeches against nationalism some years ago, are now the nationalists, because that's the most convenient ideology they can have access to in order simply to maintain themselves in their positions. So, because of that and because of the other conflicts, we have seen what is happening in some parts of Eastern Europe. But while we have been witnessing this process in Eastern Europe, we observe that in Western Europe, nationalism as a movement, as an ideology, has mellowed. Instead of continuous national conflicts, we have witnessed an unprecedented degree of cooperation, as expressed through the establishment and development of the European community. The economic forces at work, the globalization of the world economy, the technological revolution and the revolution in communications will preclude the division of the world into nearly 8,000 states, because this is the number of language groups in the world. Or if you don't want 8,000, you can take 700, which is the number of major language groups in the world. I do not believe that it is a historical coincidence that even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we still have less than 200 states members of the United Nations, and that some of them are so small that they are trying to overcome their smallness through regional associations or groupings. In fact, the nation-state system which developed in the 19th and 20th century, and which will continue to be a dominating factor in world politics, has significantly weakened. If we can speak of a tendency in world politics today, is exactly this phenomenon of the weakening of the nation-state and the strengthening of the multilateral organizations. Many state powers, both in terms of economic and foreign policy, have had to be surrendered to multilateral institutions. There is no evidence of a historical inevitability which, as in a Greek tragedy, will lead the world towards its destruction as a result of the continuous growth of nationalistic conflicts. On the contrary, if we were to talk of a tendency, I would say that we should speak of a tendency which will be gradually leading towards the strengthening of multilateral organizations and the weakening, in that sense, of the nation-state, without, however, wishing to make the forecast that the nation-state will one day cease to exist. In my opinion, it will be with us for the foreseeable future, for our children and grandchildren, but more and more weak and with more and more stronger multilateral organizations of various kinds. At the same time, I do not think that we are on the verge of a clash of giants in the form of a clash of civilizations. I do not know how many of you have read the famous article. I assume many of you. But I think it is an oversimplification to think simply in terms of coherent Asian or Islamic civilizations as opposed to the Western one. As the distinguished professor Shirley Williams told you, I have worked a lot in the Middle East, and I know that differences between various Arab states and within many of these Arab states are as many, if not more, as differences that exist in the Western world. It is an oversimplification to think of these people all united against us being the West. Not only developments in the last decades, but also prevailing tendencies point towards the greater need for cooperation between the various areas of the world, towards increasing globalization, rather than towards conflict and fragmentation. And despite the fact that we do have tendencies for conflict, and we have phenomena like the Islamic fundamentalism, that it is not the subject of what I want to speak about tonight. I repeat, that is my personal belief, and I very strongly believe in that the prevailing tendency is that of cooperation and not of conflict. Accordingly, having dismissed the idea of inevitability, of the invisible hand that leads us in one or another direction, we can set an agenda for managing ethnic conflicts. And while I have said that ethnic conflicts is not something that has to happen, I would like to make it clear that there should be no underestimation of the danger that ethnic conflicts can represent for the world, of the destructive powers of extreme ethno-nationalism or religious and tribal bigotry and intolerance. And you don't need me to tell you about that, because you have your TV screens every day which shows you that and brings you the horror of that to your house and to your everyday lives. But I believe we can certainly check or contain these tendencies, and by adopting the right policies, gradually diffuse and ultimately find successful and lasting accommodations to the various conflicts. I do not believe there is a single way for doing that. Each ethnic conflict has its own specific causes and origins, and has to be addressed individually. But there are still some general conclusions that one can reach by studying conflicts around the world. Some straightforward norms of behavior and policy which, if followed, can lead to a better and more peaceful world. And I would like to draw some such conclusions by using the Cyprus example. In my paper, I give a detailed description of the Cyprus conflict, which I will not read out or speak to you about in detail at this moment, because I was told that my speech should not be longer than 20, maximum 25 minutes, and I have learned to be a disciplined person from my youth. It's not in fashion to be disciplined nowadays, but sometimes it's not bad. But anyway, very briefly, and those of you interested can read the paper, I want to point out that the Cyprus problem did not always exist. That in Cyprus, Greeks and Turks were living in peace together for centuries. The problem was created when the Greeks decided that they want to be independent. The British didn't want them to be independent. There was a conflict with the colonial, I'm sorry. There was a conflict, a typical colonial conflict, which led to a military confrontation. There was, for those of you that heard, called the Oka fight, and which, together with the conflict with the British, created the first signs of conflict between Turks and Greeks, because the British government, in order to strengthen its position, encouraged the Turks to have a different position. The conflict ended with a compromise, which called the Zurich-London Agreement and the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960. But Cypriots were not experienced in politics. They had never governed themselves. And the constitution that was worked out, as usually all these kind of constitutions, which are the result of compromises, was like that famous animal that had the head of a camel and the body of a horse, and so on and so on. According to a constitutional expert, it was the most difficult constitution and probably the most rigid constitution in the world. Therefore, the residual resentments from the period of the anti-colonial conflict, fanned by the influence from both Greece and Turkey, and reinforced competing nationalist ideals, And some proposals for some constitutional changes led to a flare-up which started in 1963. Efforts to overcome that flare-up failed because Turkey's objectives towards Cyprus were essentially strategic. As the foreign minister of Turkey in those days himself very clearly pointed out, Turkey considered Cyprus as very crucial for its own safety. It considered that it provides security to its underbelly, and it could never and should never be a Greek-controlled island. And therefore, he said, even if there would be no Turkish Cypriots, one of the Turkish politicians said, we would still have to care about Cyprus. It was the geostrategic significance of Cyprus that made Turkey insist that they would have control over the island. And as the efforts to achieve a solution and an agreement could not lead to results, and the situation was complicated with the unfortunate provisional death of democracy in Greece and the creation of the military dictatorship, the Greek junta, there was a stalemate. Then in 1974, the Greek colonels made the tragic error of organizing a coup against the then leader of Cyprus, Archbishop Makarios, and Turkey, which was waiting for an excuse, used this excuse to invade Cyprus. They invaded. They used as a pretext the fact that they were the guarantor power, and they occupied an area which was a foothold large enough to secure their interests, as they said, but the reason for which they invaded had ceased to exist 7 days after the invasion. The coup collapsed and constitutional order was restored. Despite that, Turkey went on, and despite the efforts of a good friend of Shirley Williams, Mr. Callahan, who was then the foreign secretary, to stop them, he failed, and Turkey went on into the second invasion, occupied nearly 40% of the islands, and because they knew that the occupied area, whatever they did, and even if they had taken over all the Turks from the rest of Cyprus, because Turks and Greeks were living dispersed around the island, they would still be outnumbered by Greeks. They introduced for the first time in post-war history in Europe the concept of ethnic cleansing. And how is it done? You've now seen it on TV screens. It's done by, when you invade first and when you occupy, you do a number of crimes, you kill, you rape, you beat people, and more importantly, you let people know of what you are doing. And then when the second invasion started, the troops and the tanks were proceeding at a very slow pace. And the people were terrified, knowing that what had happened to other friends of theirs would happen to them, and they were fleeing in front of the troops that were moving forward. So by the time the Turkish troops stopped, they had occupied a vacuum. I mean, the people had fled, the houses had remained empty because they were scared to death. And then they moved on the Turkish Cypriots from the south, and because there were not enough, they brought in a great number of settlers, and they created a new situation. That's what happened. Nearly 1/3 of the population became refugees in their own country, and since then, there has been innumerable number of UN resolutions trying to, in order to solve the problem, to have the troops withdrawn and to have a peaceful solution to the problem, a solution which would have to be now based on a federation with two constituent parts, one controlled by the Turkish Cypriots and one by the Greek Cypriots. But all these efforts failed because there was a lack of political will. And I can tell you, I have spent many sleepless nights. I have talked with every leader in the world. We have had great hopes in '91 when President Bush went to Turkey and pushed President Özal, and he came out in the lawn of the White House and announced, very happy, that I am pleased, gentlemen, the world, to announce you that in a month's time there will be a conference at which the Cyprus problem will be solved. And unfortunately, probably that was one of the few cases, I don't remember of any other case, where a president of the United States has been let down in such a way by his allies, because he was promised things which in a few weeks the Turkish government reneged upon, and again we had a complete breakdown of all the efforts and no progress. And the situation continued like that until the last big flare-up of meetings last year, when I spent more time in New York and I ate more dishes in various restaurants, going around, talking with people and preparing and so on, than probably ever in my life. And still, despite all the efforts and activity and so on, we were still not able to make progress, although the 5 permanent members of the Security Council were directly involved in the negotiations. And not to think that I'm exaggerating, because I happened to be the negotiator and the president in those days. I can say to you that any observer or anybody interested, he can look at the report of the Secretary General, who is not a biased person, to the Security Council last November, and he will see there that from that report that all the efforts failed because, unfortunately, the Turkish side was insistent on not accepting the principles of a solution that the United Nations had unanimously accepted. So, very, very briefly, that is the essence of the Cyprus problem. And let us now think of some conclusions and general findings that are relevant for ethnic conflicts around us. First of all, violent ethnic conflicts are not inevitable. Antagonism or friction between communities or nationalities may be encountered in practically every country, even in this country. But this does not mean that such friction should be permitted or will, under any circumstances, lead to armed conflict. The two communities in Cyprus could have continued living in peace if the right policies had been adopted from the beginning. And we could claim the same about Bosnia and many other cases. If the proposals included in this year's report on the protection of minorities by the UN Subcommission on Human Rights were to be accepted and implemented, then we could prevent violent conflicts in the future. The second conclusion is that even when a conflict develops, tensions rise and violence is used, it does not have to escalate and become a major armed conflict. The biggest danger of ethnic conflicts, growing and escalating, arises when neighboring regional or world powers take advantage of a conflict in order to promote their own interests or other strategic interests. We are all grateful to God for the fact that the world has developed sufficiently in the last 80 years to mean that a shot in Sarajevo does not herald the beginning of a Third World War. The tragic town of Sarajevo is not only the symbol of all the misery and suffering that ethnic conflicts can cause, but is also a symbol of the fact that the world at the end of the 20th century is not the same as the world at the beginning of the century. You all remember how the First World War started with that famous shot in Sarajevo. Thanks God, the major European powers were able to resist the temptation this time, and instead of trying to take advantage of the conflict, they tried to limit and solve it. Intervention by outside regional powers, whatever their grievances, should be prohibited, and any power that is trying to intervene should be made to understand by the international community that there is a price to pay. The sad example of Cyprus, where Turkey was able to invade and continue holding the occupied territories for such a long period, cannot and should not be permitted or tolerated in any other case. Obviously, the best way to ensure that principle is to make sure that there are no precedents. Because if the aggressor can be rewarded in one case, then it will act as an encouragement for other future aggressors. I would not like to give you examples of how many cases there would be in Europe today where major powers interfere if they so wished in order allegedly to protect the interests of their kin. The worst earlier examples is that of Hitler's invasion of Poland and Czechoslovakia and all that followed. I reiterate that by eliminating interference from outside, we will significantly reduce the danger of ethnic conflicts escalating and proliferating. Thirdly, the United Nations is the only international body which can be entrusted with the management of ethnic conflicts. Many criticisms can be heard and made about the efficiency or inefficiency of the United Nations or of various of its missions. What we have not heard, however, is what is the alternative to the United Nations. The truth is very simple. The United Nations is the only international body to which the people of this world can turn for assistance. It is an indispensable instrument necessary in order to ensure respect for international law and to help both in peacekeeping and peacemaking. The UN should also be the only international body that can use force legitimately. Paraphrasing Max Weber's famous definition of the state, we could say that the United Nations is that international agency within the world which possesses the monopoly of legitimate violence. Violence or peace enforcement can only be used and should be used as a last resort. The examples of Bosnia and Somalia show the limitations and the pitfalls. Kuwait proved that peace enforcement is possible and can be successfully carried out. Obviously, we cannot and should not, because of the difficulties encountered in Somalia, lose hope and resign from the possibility of using force if necessary. What is important is not to be in a hurry to use force, and before undertaking a task, to prepare well and study carefully all eventualities and implications. We need to help the United Nations to be even more efficient. That is not simply a matter of administrative improvement or better control. It is primarily a matter of political will on the part of the major powers that are the backbone of the UN system. It has been proved time and time again that where there is lack of cooperation and dedication to a specific mission by any of the UN permanent members, then the relevant mission of the United Nations cannot be effective. Cyprus was a sad example of this truth during the Cold War period. The major task ahead of us now is to further strengthen the United Nations and give it the opportunity to establish and manage a reliable system of collective and universal security which comprises peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace enforcement. Fourthly, Peacekeeping is good and necessary, but inadequate. It has to be followed by peacemaking. Today we have 13 peacekeeping missions around the world, and in 1993 the overall cost of these peacekeeping missions is estimated to be in excess of $43 billion. Many people criticize the United Nations because they hear about these peacekeeping missions and all those billions. And they hear about these missions being renewed year after year without the conflicts being solved. The truth is that there is a world of difference between peacekeeping on the one hand and peacemaking on the other. Sometimes peacekeeping, if it lasts for a long time, can become a substitute for peacemaking. And instead of punishing the aggressor, rewards him with continuous control over the occupied territories. The lack of peacemaking has not been the fault of the UN as such, but has been due to the lack of political will of the members of the Security Council, particularly the 5 permanent members. Innumerable articles have been written about the situation in Bosnia and the lack of action. But I would like to illustrate this through the example of Cyprus. The UN peacekeepers in Cyprus have fulfilled an admirable task. They have behaved in an impeccable way, and I would like to take this opportunity and pay my tribute in this forum as well to those brave men from all over the world who tried to help us in times of difficulty and continue to work for that. And some of them gave their lives as a result of accidents or other small incidents. But the bitter truth, however, is that nearly 20 years of peacekeeping has not in any way contributed towards peacemaking. On the contrary, it has enabled Turkey to strengthen its hold on the occupied area, to bring in Turkish settlers, to change the demographic character of the occupied area, and to hope that with the passage of time the world will come to accept the de facto situation and legitimize the crime committed by Turkey 20 years ago. The reason was quite simple. In the days of the Cold War, the UN Security Council was able to reach decisions about peacekeeping, but was unable to promote peacemaking. Turkey, although in the wrong, was a trusted ally of NATO and therefore had to be shielded and cultivated. With the end of the Cold War, we hoped that in the new world order it would be easier to solve the Cyprus problem. But again, the strategic importance attributed to Turkey, the situation in Iraq and various other developments meant that the velvet policy towards Turkey continued. If we now extrapolate what happened in Turkey to the rest of the world, where UN peacekeeping missions, to Cyprus, where UN peacekeeping missions are permanently in operation, we will understand that peacekeeping by itself, although important, as I said before, not only fails to solve problems, but on the contrary, in cases similar to Cyprus, helps to maintain the fait accompli created by the aggressors. Talking about this subject to Chancellor Kohl 2 years ago, I told him, how many years do you give Chancellor to the UN peacekeeping force in Croatia? Would you be prepared to keep paying for that for the next 10 or 20 years? And he looked to me and he was surprised. And then I said to him, well, in Cyprus it has lasted 20 years. I don't see why it cannot last in Croatia. But you can understand that in Cyprus was only a few thousand people. In Croatia it's many more. And there is a limit as to how much the UN or the world is willing to accept. But then, even if they had unlimited money, an unlimited peacekeeping effort in itself is the solution. And unless we want to see the United System collapsing under the weight of its many peacekeeping missions, which keep increasing, the international community must make it clear that peacekeeping is not an indefinite operation. As President Clinton correctly pointed out, for every operation, we must clearly define the objective and set time limits. This necessity implies that peacekeeping must be used only as part of UN progress towards peacemaking. Peacemaking can be achieved, but not merely through goodwill. It also requires determination. No aggressor will return territory that he has occupied unless he becomes convinced that by continuing his occupation, he is paying a higher price than he benefits from the occupation. And that requires determination and political will on the part of the major powers of this world. Fifth, the United Nations can be effective only if its resolutions are respected and implemented. Selective support and implementation of UN resolutions is not only morally wrong, but politically inadvisable. It simply encourages countries to ignore UN resolutions and undermines the effectiveness and even the very existence of the organization. Everyone agrees that respect for international law and order is the best way to safeguard human and minority rights and to avoid conflicts. But we can only have international law and order if UN resolutions without exceptions are implemented. Although Cyprus has suffered greatly, we have never advocated the use of force in solving our problem. We have always believed in the need for peaceful negotiations. But negotiations can succeed only if both sides are willing to reach an agreement. If the aggressor or the stronger party is negotiating simply in order to gain time, as Turkey has been in the case of Cyprus, negotiations do not work in the desired direction. On the contrary, they help to perpetuate the injustice. The only way to avoid such a situation arising is to convey the message clearly to both sides that if negotiations fail, and if the international community is convinced that this is due to the lack of goodwill by one side, then action will be taken. In today's interdependent world, there are not many countries that can afford international condemnation or even worse, isolation. It is enough to convey the message to all present and potential aggressors, to all ethno-nationalists that want to promote their own specific interests to the detriment of others, that such action will not be tolerated, and that the world community is united in this decision. This is the best way to manage ethnic conflicts and ensure that ethnic conflicts do not escalate into armed conflicts. Sixth and finally, I should like to point out that if we want to make sure that such conflicts are less frequent in the future, we need to address the causes of these conflicts. There, as a rule, and practically without exception, are to be found in economic underdevelopment, deprivation, growing inequalities between regions or countries, and the lack of democratic institutions. Do not be afraid. I do not wish to embark on a new speech on how to achieve international economic development on a world scale, or how to strengthen democracy, but simply to point out the obvious, namely that development, increasing economic cooperation and world trade, freedom of movement of capital and labor, strengthening of democracy and democratic institutions, and protection of human rights are the only means of addressing the increasing threats of extreme nationalism, chauvinism, intolerance, and bigotry. Ethnic conflicts can be managed. A new world order of peace and security can reign supreme. The possibilities are there. What we need is the will, the determination, and vision on the part of world leaders that will spare no effort in order to achieve this noble aim. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for a very forceful and comprehensive speech, and thank you too for your message of optimism at the end of that speech. We've now got about 15 minutes for questions, so may I ask if anybody would like to ask the first question? Yes, there we are. I'm so sorry. I should have added, there are microphones at both sides of the hall, so please walk down to the microphones if you'd like to ask a question. This gentleman here.
Good evening, President Vassiliou. My name is David Shore. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Your point is very well taken that there are usually outside powers involved in such conflicts. The problem I want to put in front of you is this, that rarely is their involvement or intervention as blatant as the Turkish invasion. Often we're talking about manipulations such as Russia's guise of peacekeeping in Tajikistan, or the rogue military units in Moldova, or the toleration of the violation of sanctions as Greece has been accused of. What should the international community do in these less blatant cases where these counterproductive roles have been played by outside powers? Would you have the international community condemn such more subtle manipulations and interventions?
Certainly we have to condemn them. Of course, let me say that in the case of Greece, from what I know, there has been no break of the embargo. But irrespectively of that, I think if we have proofs of intervention does not have to be military. Intervention can be by, for example, supplying arms. In the case of Cyprus, for example, at the beginning, there was no military intervention. There was sending of arms. Then there was limited military intervention and so on. But we have variations, millions of variations of this theme of intervention by the interested party. What is important, as you correctly said, is that we have to make it clear that we are not prepared to tolerate that. But here is the crux of the matter, that if you want to be virtuous, you have to give the example. And you cannot differentiate. You cannot say that in this case, I interfere because I think I am morally right to do so. In the other case, the other side should not interfere because, in my opinion, they are not morally right to do so. From the moment we decide that we want to condemn intervention, then we have to do that through the United Nations, for example, of course, for every case, and the international community must be prepared to speak frankly about this. Otherwise, we will have flare-up of conflicts and support of conflicts, and usually the cost of it is much higher than one can envisage at the beginning.
Thank you.
Question over there.
My name is Antoninka. I'm the first-year student I'm from Russia, from Moscow. So we are one of the countries who's suffering, from the ethnic conflicts for quite a long time. And I actually disagree with the person who asked the question before, because I see that our countries mostly look towards the particular countries because they really can help, because the situation is that the measures have to be undertaken right now. Like, for example, Azerbaijan is looking toward Turkey maybe, or Georgia towards Russia, Moldova towards Russia, maybe because it's traditionally nationally close countries. How do you think this mechanism in regulating the conflicts which have to be regulated now, the measures have to be taken now, because the United Nations is not an effective body because they cannot take the decision right away, and it takes a long time and people just die there in the regions. How do you think this mechanism, is it more effective, you think, in the short term to really appeal to a certain country which can help immediately rather than wait until the United Nations or EC or whatever can make suggestions, which takes time and people's lives?
I see your point, and I'm quite familiar with the cases you refer to. Without appearing to interfere in the policy of Russia, what I want to make clear is, in my opinion, I don't say that there should be no effort by a big power to solve a problem or to assist. What I say is that if a country, it's better if this is done on a multilateral basis. That's the ideal world. If it cannot be done on a multilateral basis and it's done on a unilateral basis, like in the case of Russia, it has to be done above the board. What the gentleman before mentioned was not, for example, the help that today Russia is giving in Georgia for maintaining the route from Tiflis to the sea. What one is referring is if it is true that some Russians, not with the help of the government, but on their own initiative, have helped the Abkhazian rebels in their fight against the Georgian government. And that kind of covert support, of covert intervention by anybody is what is the problem. If a country openly, above the board, takes a decision and believes that what it's doing is right, and is prepared to accept, if it's not right, international condemnation, then I don't think it's a problem.
Thank you.
My name is Andreas Togias. Considering the fact that Cyprus is not really an ethnic problem, as you have stated it, but it's really due to the expansionist policy of Turkey as it is presently being experienced now, and all negotiations through the United Nations, based on the assumption that it is an ethnic problem, an ethnic conflict, have failed to solve it, all those days in New York with no result. You being one of the leading figures in Cyprus, I mean, what other alternatives have you considered so as to be more effective in getting Turkey to realize that the expansionist policy and the occupation of Cyprus must terminate? I mean, what else can be done? I mean, if they are not ready to negotiate, I mean,
I can tell you what cannot be done, and that's war.
I know, yeah, I agree with you, but
Unfortunately, there is no shortcut. There is no shortcut. And Cyprus is a military, is in a way a conflict between Turkey and Cyprus, but also it is an ethnic conflict. It would be a mistake to underestimate the fact that there was an ethnic conflict between the two communities. And at the end of the day, it's an ethnic conflict that, as I explained, has been accentuated and cannot be solved because of outside interference. And in that sense, in order to solve it, we have to make sure that the outside interference stops, and that can only be achieved through determined international action through the United Nations. Now, the fact that until now this hasn't happened, it's not a reason for us to resign and say that it will not happen. I still believe that it's worth fighting for getting this international activity, because war, it's not a recipe I would ever recommend for solving any conflict. Sometimes you read in many papers cynical statements by journalists that, well, they will keep fighting until they are tired, and when they are tired of killing each other, then they will sit down and discuss. It may be true, but we cannot afford to encourage such a situation. We have to try and avoid it, because it's easy to talk about killings from the outside, but if you are on the receiving end, you don't like it that much.
My name is Len Berger, and I'm just visiting here, and I saw the talk advertised, so I thought to come. And you spoke toward the end of your talk about the resolutions of the United Nations Subcommittee on Minority Rights, and those being an important part of managing ethnic conflicts. The constitution that you referred to earlier in the case of Cyprus, it seems to me that constitution saw Cyprus, the Turkish community, less in terms of a minority with rights to be protected than as a partner in a government which had things like the vice presidency guaranteed to it and so on. And there seemed to be a conflicting view of partnership on one hand and protection of minority rights, as you've spoken. Do you feel that that's a valid characterization of different perceptions of the Cypriot problem? And do you see any middle road between those two perceptions?
When I referred to the minority report of the UN subcommittee, I wasn't referring to Cyprus. I was referring because I tried to use the Cyprus case as an example for drawing conclusions for problems around Europe or around the world. And I believe that that report of the UN subcommittee, if it's actioned upon, can be very effective and can help addressing issues of minorities both in Europe and in other parts of the world, and avoid conflicts arising because of minority differences. Now, in the case of Cyprus, we had an armed conflict which ended in a compromise, and one of the elements of the compromise is that the Turkish Cypriots were not considered a minority but a community, an equal community under the constitution. And one of the reasons of the conflict is that for a certain period, the Greek Cypriot community was not prepared to accept fully those rights of the Turkish Cypriot community. Because, as you know, there is nothing in which there are no faults. All the faults are only on the one side. There are always faults on both sides. And I'm talking now in the period before, at the early 60s, right. A great number of Greek Cypriots were thinking that dealing with the Turkish Cypriots as a community with equal rights, although they were only 18% of the population and not as a minority, it was unfair. And logically, it may have been unfair, but politically, it was a compromise that had been accepted. And one of the golden rules for the future, in any case, is that once a compromise is made, neither of the two parties should be encouraged to get out of it because the cost is much higher afterwards. Therefore, the lines of a solution now, what we have been working for, of establishing a federation, not only gives community rights to the Turkish Cypriots, but much more than that. But I don't think we should go into the details.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one last question. I was going to ask if you were going to make your sort of sedentary position, but not.
Okay. Okay, my name is Dimitris Zopos. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. I was going to ask, you talked about political will of the countries, especially the permanent members of the Security Council. And I was wondering, in terms of priorities, do you think that permanent members should address issues and questions which are easier to solve, or should they go for the bigger issues? Because obviously, I mean, for Cyprus, now I think it's more convenient for the permanent members to actually address a simpler, smaller issue which they can have an effect on rather than go for Bosnia or Somalia, which are bigger issues. What do you think? What's your personal opinion on this? What should the countries go for?
I think that the way the United Nations Security Council works is not like a household where you decide that today I will do this and tomorrow I'll do that. Usually, unfortunately for them, the causes are brought to them because of developments, and they have to deal with what is on the plate. It's like you going home, not you, but when you will get married, going home and eating what your wife will offer you, or what you offer your wife, whatever. But the point is, that's how the Security Council is working. I mean, they are dished with table. On the table, dishes are coming, and they have to eat it. They have to handle it. And there is no logic in it. In one case, it's a major issue. Another case, it's a small issue. In one case, it's an issue where there's a lot of killing. In another case, an issue which comes for reconsideration and so on. But certainly, if you want to put priorities, you would say that you address, first of all, those issues where there is more suffering or where there is more immediate killing and so on, and then try to address other issues. But as a rule, the United Nations can handle simultaneously many issues. The problem is more a political problem, is that we are gradually moving from the Cold War period where the tendency was not to touch on problems, but simply conserve them, put them in the fridge and keep them there as long as they don't explode, to a new situation in the New World Order where we have to deal with problems, and we need to deal with problems and address them. And that transition, it's easy to say from the outside, but it's much more difficult to implement from the inside. If you are a political leader in a great country that has many other problems, it's not so easy for you to carry out this transition and be so active in foreign policy, and you know what that meant in this country anyway, that sometimes it's even negative. So there is no recipe. But what I can say, and since this is the last question I want to point out, that is that we have to realize and recognize that we live in an interdependent world. The United States of America may be a great country, may be the richest country in the world, may be the most democratic and the most unique country, and you can be justifiably proud about your country, but cannot anymore live on its own. It is part of the world, and whether you like it or not, you have responsibilities. You are the superpower. There is not a second superpower. You are the only country that has the economic and military power to interfere, and you cannot, whether you like it or not, abdicate your world leadership responsibilities. If you like, you are, for the foreseeable future, condemned to act as the world's leaders. And therefore, you have to take care of even unpleasant situations like those in Somalia, or like those in Bosnia, or like those in Cyprus. In every case, in a different way, of course, but you have to care, you have to have a policy, you have to do something, because at the end of the day, if the world becomes an anarchic world, if there is chaos in the world, the price will be paid by everybody, and of course by the United States as well. So let us hope. By the way, having said that, I'm not addressing myself to the leadership of the United States, because I know they are aware of that. I'm addressing more to the public of the United States, where sometimes people think that they can isolate themselves. They can behave like if nothing is happening around them. Well, it may be costly, but it's still much cheaper to interfere than not to do anything, because the price afterwards will be much, much higher. And I want to close by thanking you for being here, by your interest. And I want to repeat, although televisions and news journalists are specializing in presenting the bad side of the world, the killings, the suffering, there is a lot of good happening around the world. And together with all these negative developments, we have a lot of positive developments. And if we look at the world objectively at this moment, we can say that we can be optimistic. We see this huge revolution in technology, this changing of the world every day, this breakdown of barriers, the communication revolution, which really made the world into a small place to live in. We see the advantages of economic development going much wider than ever before. And okay, we see a lot of suffering, a lot of killing, a lot of incidents, but I think it is within our power to control it and to build a better and safer world for all of us. And I'm sure that all of you students of politics in this famous school will, in one or another way, contribute in making this a better world. And I wish you good luck in your efforts.
Out of terrible things like the tragedy of Cyprus, good things come. And I think we've heard one of the good things tonight, the wisdom and the vision of the former president of Cyprus. And on your behalf, I would like once again to thank him very warmly for coming and sharing with us his views tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.